Today we're diving into Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. I've been interested in this one since I first learned about Vance. That was when Trump picked him to be his running mate. And I knew pretty soon this was a book I wanted to get into, so I did, and I found it rewarding. I actually read this one as a physical book rather than an audiobook, and I'll just get into it. The book starts with an introduction chapter talking about hillbilly life and culture in general. J.D. defines it as the group of people of Scotch-Irish descent living in the Appalachian mountain range. And he describes a complex culture with complex and deep problems. Of course, starting out reading the book, most people will already know that J.D. made it pretty far in life, graduated Yale, worked in the Senate, and currently he's the vice president-elect. And in the introduction, it's laid out pretty clearly that his success story is an unlikely one. Throughout the book, though, gradually, as we get the fuller picture, we get a better understanding of just how unlikely it was. Quote from this introduction, "Today people look at me and assume that I'm some sort of genius, that only a truly extraordinary person could have made it to where I am today. With all due respect to those people, I think that theory is a load of bullshit." End quote. The introduction leaves the reader with the sense that these problems, or a lot of them at least, could be solved if the people involved just took more personal responsibility for their lives. He gives examples of people who had every reason to work hard, but they ended up being lazy at their job and getting fired. And more examples than just that. And if you only look at the introduction, it might feel a bit like old man lecturing you on how to live life properly. But throughout the wider book, it becomes pretty clear that improving quality of life in the hillbilly world is something that he spent time thinking about and grappling with. Talks about a theory that a lot of people have. A theory that I would guess a lot of people, when they say something like this, haven't fully thought it through, but the theory that if they only had better jobs, everything else would improve in their lives. J.D. disagrees. He thinks it's a more personal change that needs to happen within individuals. A good thing to try to look out for and pick up on when you analyze a book is try and pin down the author's purpose for writing. I have a quote here that's at least part of the purpose, but not the whole story. Page 2 of the introduction, quote, "I want people to understand the American dream as my family encountered it. I want people to understand how upward mobility really feels." End quote. And throughout the book, he did explain this in a better way than just the introduction alone would have conveyed. Explained it in a way that makes upward mobility seem, I don't know, for lack of a better word, like something that feels counterintuitive, at least to the person moving upwards. Something that's bittersweet, something that comes with some kind of disillusionment. But we will get to that part of the book. J.D. begins with a brief family history, talks about his grandparents moving from Kentucky to Ohio to chase a job in that region in the 1940s. At the time, Middletown, Ohio, the place where they moved, was a factory town, and this one factory basically kept the whole town going, and people would come from a little further south, from Kentucky in that general area. A lot of people migrated to Ohio and surrounding areas to take part in the industrial boom that was happening there. The grandparents got married younger than they should have. The family started out pretty shaky. The dad became an alcoholic. The mom, of course, had a hard time growing up. I'm brushing over a lot of details, but I wanted to purposely go through a lot of the plot points pretty quickly so I can focus more on the main ideas of the book. J.D.'s mom started having kids, and her dad got sober in time to not be messed up for most of those kids' childhood. J.D. has an older half-sister, biological half-sister, named Lindsay, who he grew up with, he's really close to. But mom would always go from man to man to man. J.D.'s dad was out of his life at an early age. He was always told that the dad simply put him up for adoption, he didn't care. And throughout his childhood, he would often move around a lot. Mom, of course, had a long list of love interests. He described often not expecting step-siblings to stay around for very long, and relatively often, as a child, he would have to pack up his things and go live somewhere else with mom. Despite that, though, the mom worked really hard to make sure he had a good early education. Got him a library card, made sure he did reading at home, all that good stuff. And the mom's parents, who were very present in his childhood, always tried to teach him the values of faith and hard work. Quote from Mama, who is the maternal grandmother, quote, "Never be like those fucking losers who think the deck is stacked against them. You can do anything you want to." End quote. At one point in his childhood, he does get the opportunity to reconnect and spend time with his dad again, even going as far as living with him for a little while. This was during a time where mom's own life was a little more unstable than usual. Finds out from the father that he actually did fight really hard for custody, but he saw that the custody battle was causing a lot of problems for J.D. I believe he was 6 at the time, don't quote me on that. So that would have been first grade. Describes grade slipping, describes teachers and guidance counselors noticing that something was going on in his home life to cause red flags to go up based on his behavior in school. So despite how much the dad wanted to be a part of his life, he saw that carrying on the legal battle, carrying on the fight against his mom was hurting the son. So in the end, the dad just gave up and folded and let the mom have full custody, even knowing how messed up the mom's life is. The dad, on the other hand, has a lot more stable home life. He has a new wife, he has new kids, and he's religious in a stricter way than JD is used to. If you imagine the stereotypical Southern Baptist who believes the earth is 6,000 years old, that's sort of the impression I get from what the book describes. Now, the story of why JD's dad comes back into the picture, why his mom decided that she would allow him to see that child again, starts with the death of Papa, who is husband to Mama and father to JD's mom. This is where we see Mama, who had been a pretty solid figure in JD's childhood, show a lot more vulnerability than anyone was used to. This is also when we see JD's mother sort of snap. Turns out, of course she worked as a nurse, turns out she had been abusing prescription drugs for quite a while. JD was at a young enough age that he didn't really pick up on a lot of the warning signs, but to the rest of the family it was pretty obvious. And he describes one event where the mom ended up throwing a fit in public in the front lawn and ultimately got taken away in a police car. And that's when it snapped and JD realized his mom had a problem. So that's the parent figure JD has. And then of course Mama, the source of strength. Quote, "In the months after Papa's death, I remembered the woman I found in an isolated corner of Deaton's funeral home, and couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter what aura of strength Mama projected, the other woman lived somewhere inside her," end quote. The other woman, of course, referring to the version of her that he saw in the nursing home, sad in a way he had never seen her before. Ends up relying on his older sister Lindsay for a lot of things, even though she herself is just a high school kid. Describes a period of time where basically the two of them were living by themselves. Tells an anecdote about getting a truancy letter to the house that needs to be signed by a parent or legal guardian, but they don't have any of those around, so Lindsay just signs the letter herself. And this is the period of time where JD briefly goes to California to live with his biological dad. Years go by, JD's mom is in and out of sobriety. Lindsay does get married and has a kid. Now, at the age of 14, about to enter high school. The mom, of course, has moved around different places to live with boyfriends before, but this time, she would like to move 45 miles away to Dayton, Ohio. This, of course, would take JD pretty far away from Mama, who has been a very important figure up to this point. And to illustrate the choice that he had here, he describes a visit that he had where his mom took him to talk to her therapist about anger problems, and for some reason the three of them, all three, were in the room together. And the therapist, of course, has been seeing his mom for a long time, so of course he only knows her side of the story. Starts questioning JD in a little bit of an accusing way, and that's when he realizes it will not be good for him to live with his mom during this time. However, if he lives with Mama, he feels he will be a burden to her. His sister has her own family now, so that's not really an option either. He goes to live with his dad, at least for one summer, but ultimately he ends up returning to Ohio for school. He describes an event from this period of time where his mom burst into the room and asked him for a pee sample because she knew that she was going to be drug tested at work. Describes this as a sort of turning point where JD goes and lives with Mama in a more permanent way. Describes the following 3 years more permanently living with Mama as a period of time that saved him. Now, I have a quote from this part of the book. This type of quote that this is, I would normally save it for the end, but I feel like this sort of atmosphere of his childhood needs a little more description. So I'll read this particular quote now. Quote, "Why didn't our neighbor leave that abusive man? Why did she spend her money on drugs? Why couldn't she see that her behavior was destroying her daughter? Why were all of these things happening, not just to our neighbor, but to my mom? It would be years before I learned that no single book or expert or field could fully explain the problems of hillbillies in modern America. Our elegy is a sociological one, yes, but it is also about psychology and community and culture and faith," end quote. So JD's final years of high school end up being relatively more stable than his middle school time was. And now we get to the point where he's thinking about college. Quote, I began to worry for another reason. I wasn't ready. Not all investments are good investments. All of that debt, and for what? Doing well in college required grit, and I had far too little of it, end quote. On a personal note, I also had far too little of that grit. I should have waited. I would have done a lot better with a gap year. But I did not have this level of self-awareness at the time. But again, on a personal note, parents, please do not push your kids straight into college out of high school. It's an adult decision. They need to think about where they want to be in 10, 15 years and base their education plans or not education plans off of that. Not just go to college, especially not if they're undecided about a major. But on with the narrative. JD has a cousin named Rachel who is a veteran. Rachel encourages JD to join the Marines. Quote, they'll whip your ass into shape, unquote. This is around the year 2002. So notably, this is only 6 months or so after 9/11. Quote, like any self-respecting hillbilly, I considered heading to the Middle East to kill terrorists. But the prospect of military service frightened me, until Rachel told me to talk to a recruiter, implicitly arguing that she thought I could handle it. Joining the Marines seemed as plausible as flying to Mars. Now I could think of nothing but the Marine Corps, end quote. Another quote, it was college or nothing or the Marines, and I didn't like either of the first two options, end quote. His family did take a lot of having to get warmed up to the idea. Mama in particular never liked it, but that is the route he ended up going. And something interesting, quote, I imagine life 4 years later, and I saw a world without my grandmother in it. Something inside me knew that she wouldn't survive my time in the Marines. I'd never come home again, at least not permanently. Home was Middletown with Mama in it, and by the time I finished with the Marines, Mama would be gone, end quote. So call it a premonition, but he knew that his grandmother didn't have 4 full years left. But nevertheless, he goes off to boot camp. Quote, there are no phone calls in boot camp. I realized through letters how much my family loved me. While most other recruits received a letter every day or two, I sometimes received half a dozen each night. Recruiters told families that what most of us needed were words of encouragement, and Mama delivered that in spades, end quote. And that's a really touching detail to this story. Well, I call it a story, but it's his real life. He describes boot camp, talks about the Marines giving him self-confidence and teaching him to overcome any obstacle he's faced with, and describes overcoming a sense of learned helplessness. Now, for those who didn't study psychology, the way I learned this term in Psych 101 was an experiment where a dog is placed in a room with an electric floor, and they give electric shocks to the floor for a long enough time that the dog knows the electric shocks are coming. But then they do something, they open up a door to a second room that does not have the electric floor, and they discover after a certain amount of time receiving those shocks, even when the dog is able to escape that, he does not. He continues being in the room where the floor is electric, because he simply learned that no effort on his part could stop the floor being electric. And there's another study, this time with rats. They put a rat in a tank of water, and the control group, they do nothing, they just wait and see how long until the rat lets itself sink. But then the other group, they first use human intervention, they use a human hand to save the rat from the water, but then they put the rat back in the water. They discovered that the rat who had been saved once will keep swimming for hours and hours and hours, but then the rat who had never been saved, because they don't expect that help to come, they will let themselves sink in less than 20 minutes. So there's this phenomena in psychology that if you get beaten down long enough, you stop looking for ways to climb out of that situation. And that's what JD means when he says that boot camp helped him overcome learned helplessness. Quote, from Middletown's world of small expectations to the constant chaos of our home, life had taught me that I had no control. Mama and Papa had saved me from succumbing entirely to that notion, and the Marine Corps broke new ground. If I had learned helplessness at home, the Marines were teaching me learned willfulness. End quote. And here's another personal note. If there was an option to go through boot camp but then not have to do military service afterwards, I would probably have done it. Because I can see just from reading about it, for a long time I've seen just how much self-improvement potential is there, and that's something that draws me to it. But at the end of the day, there was a point in time years ago when I was still in college where I actually did talk to a recruiter about this. The recruiter, of course, laid it out for me. For every single boot on the ground, you need cooks, you need people on the supply lines, you need drivers, you need engineers, on and on down the list of non-combat roles. He even had me take a pre-ASVAB test, and I think he was just hyping me up, but he told me I could be in military intelligence if I wanted to based on that score. But at the end of it all, I could not shake the feeling that if I was in uniform, I needed to be prepared, if necessary, to use a gun on another human, and I just wasn't, I knew I wasn't able to do that. So that's what kept me out of the military earlier in my life. But the author of this book, in that particular way, had more grit than me. But then, going back to JD's story, even more than teaching him learned willfulness, it teaches him some practical things as well. He tells an example of when he went shopping for his first car. Someone from the Marines went with him and made sure that he did his due diligence searching around different loan providers, finding a good rate for that car loan. He describes, after finishing boot camp, a period of time where he was getting paid $400 a month, okay, but he's in the military, so that's free room and board, that's free food, so that $400 went a long way. And in addition to that, he started playing online poker. Not like gambling addiction, not like losing money to it, no. Our crafty protagonist here is skilled enough at this that he actually gets a reliable income from it. And it's actually measurable, actually a couple $100 a month he gets from that. And he uses that money to start paying Mama's medical bills. Quote, "Paying for her health insurance made me feel, for the first time, like I was the protector. It gave me a sense of satisfaction I never imagined," end quote. Mama, though, died in April 2005, for those keeping track at home. That is 3 years after the summer of 2002 when JD enlisted. JD describes a weird interaction where him and his sister were in the car and his mom was driving. And his mom was having an emotional moment, to say the least, and I don't think a lot of people would blame her. Snaps at the kids for them being sad, saying she wasn't your mom, she was mine, and then Lindsay says no, she was our mom too. Now, after this, JD actually does spend some time in the Middle East with the military. His role is media relations for the Marine Corps. So he's over there doing a lot of journalistic work, documenting, taking video, preparing press releases, stuff like that. But then, soon enough, his term of service was up, and he starts looking at what's next. And he decides that now is the time for college. Quote, "When I joined the Marine Corps, I did so in part because I wasn't ready for adulthood. I didn't know how to balance a checkbook, much less how to complete the financial aid forms for college. Now, I knew exactly what I wanted out of my life and how to get there, and in 3 weeks I would start classes at Ohio State," end quote. In particular, his goal is to complete all the prerequisite courses, get all those credits, and then make his way to law school. He describes a very intense daily routine that he was prepared for because of the Marines. In the book, he lays out his average day. Classes, studying, drinking at night, wakes up early to work out, stays up late partying, and he still gets straight A's through that because he sets aside enough time to study. Only leaves himself about 4-ish hours of sleep, something like that, I forget how many. Strikes me as something I would do, at least for brief periods of time, but I know I wouldn't be able to maintain that. He did maintain that. And he had work-study jobs on top of that. Even describes a time where, because of the schedule, he got extremely sick, had to take time off to recover from that. He describes he had like 3 different work-study jobs, including tutoring and being a staffer in a state senator's office. He's crazy enough to put himself on an accelerated graduation track. Despite this heavy schedule, his guidance counselor thinks he's insane, but he does manage to do it, makes it out of state college early, and gets accepted to none other than Yale Law. And he actually talks a little about, you would think an Ivy League school like that would be one of the most expensive in the country, but surprising enough, at least according to JD, not for the lower income people. He describes a surplus of both merit-based and need-based scholarships, making it, for him, comparatively a lot cheaper than other alternative colleges he could have considered, so he even gets in with a great financial aid package. JD describes Yale as a culture shock for sure. First of all, he describes the number of prestigious alumni who come back and visit and talk to current students. And for another thing, he noticed that the kind of people, the kind of culture and environment he was familiar with was lacking on that campus. Quote, "They may look like me, but for all the Ivy League's obsession with diversity, virtually everyone, black, white, Jewish, Muslim, whatever, comes from intact families who never worry about money," end quote. And in fact, he says it was a big moment when he decided to open up to his Yale friends about just how broken his own family was. And this is the part of the book, well, the part of his life really, where he starts to ask himself that question that is central to this book, the question that is the other part of his reason for writing. I talked about at the beginning. The first part of that is the quote he gave about wanting people to understand the American dream as he saw it. But the question that came to his mind when he first started coming to Yale is, quote, why has no one else from my high school made it to the Ivy League, end quote. Why is the deck stacked so far against people from his area, people from his way of life? And he takes a short break from the narrative to explore this idea a little. Quote, one consequence of group isolation is seeing standard metrics of success as not just unattainable, but as the property of people not like us, end quote. He gives an example of going to a fancy dinner and literally not knowing what to do with the silverware. Of course, me, myself, I only half know what to do. I know, like, the rule of thumb that everyone says, start from the outside and work your way in. But from what he describes in the book, he had to learn a lot more than I currently know, just to fit in this place. But he keeps going, quote, one way our upper class can promote upward mobility, then, is not only by pushing wise public policies, but by opening their hearts and minds to the newcomers who don't quite belong, unquote. I can imagine all the people at that school whose parents make six figures, maybe seven might not be that uncommon there. I went to a university, I didn't go to Ivy League. I imagine people who aren't used to having friends whose parents are divorced. People who aren't used to knowing people that don't know how to dress nice. Another example JD gives in the book is he tried going to a job interview wearing military boots and camo pants and not really a professional outfit. And that's something else he had to learn. Quote, social mobility isn't just about money and economics, it's about a lifestyle change, end quote. And this is the part of the book where he describes his quote-unquote Yale spirit guide. That was a fellow student, a girl of Indian ethnicity, someone who would later become his wife, of course. Her name is Usha. And when he went to that fancy dinner and he didn't know what to do with the silverware, she is who he called when he needed to sneak away from that dinner to make a phone call and say, hey, I don't know what I'm doing. I need guidance. So through their time in that school, they develop a relationship. Another thing that Yale taught him was the emphasis on having a good social circle. And that means more than just social interactions. If you've ever heard the phrase, your network is your net worth, that's how they get ahead. Quote, that week of interviews showed me that successful people are playing an entirely different game. They don't flood the job market with resumes, they network, end quote. Describes watching people call up their uncle who knows this guy in this company who's able to get their resume at the top of the list. Those connections are how they get jobs, get positions, get ahead in the world. And after this, he starts describing more than just a lifestyle change, but a whole change in mentality. Or a better way to put it is confronting his inner demons by necessity. And just from the description of his childhood that I've given you so far, you can probably guess he has a lot of inner demons. And he realized those emotional issues from his past were starting to bleed into his relationship, so he started being determined to fix that before it caused him catastrophe there. Quote, I would do all of the hateful things that my mother had done, and then I'd feel guilty and desperately afraid. For so much of my life I'd made Mom out to be a kind of villain, and now I was acting like her. Nothing compares to the fear that you're becoming the monster in your closet, end quote. Quote, I realized that I had a problem, that I must confront whatever it was that had, for generations, caused those in my family to hurt those they love, end quote. If you couldn't tell, I'm being a little delicate for this part by leaning so heavily on direct quotes. But another quote, I've learned that the very traits that enabled my survival during childhood inhibit my success as an adult. I see conflict, and I run away, or prepare for battle. This makes little sense in my current relationships, but without that very attitude, my childhood homes would have consumed me, end quote. And then he describes another situation where someone pulls out in front of him when he's driving, and then they stop at a red light, and he has a strong urge to get out of the car and confront the guy. Quote, the other driver's sin was to insult my honor, and it was on that honor that nearly every element of my happiness depended as a child. It kept the school bully from messing with me, connected me to my mother when some man, or his children, insulted her, and gave me something, however small, over which I exercised complete control, end quote. That culture of honor concept, more can be said about that, but I'll save that for later. Now this is where the narrative part of the story ends and where the afterword of the book begins. But I'll pause right here for a moment. 2024, of course, J.D. Vance was the running mate for Donald Trump in that presidential election. He went around the country giving rallies.
talking directly to voters. I did go to a J.D. Vance rally to listen to him talk. I was about halfway through the book at the point that I went and saw him. Something nice is when Secret Service was still sending everyone through the metal detector, getting everything set up, getting everyone seated. The place where he was talking was an outdoor, like a large pavilion type of thing. I would say around 300 people showed up to that. And there was a big field next to the field house. There were police vehicles and Secret Service vehicles parked in the field. There were police and defense along the path where the people were going from the metal detector to the field house. So we're walking along the side of the field along that fence, and we can see in the fenced-off police area just two kids just running around playing like normal kids. So you gotta wonder, who are they? And then later on when Vance was talking, he introduces his 4-year-old and his 7-year-old, who were just out there playing with cops and playing with each other. And that was actually a really nice moment to see his family like that. And the other thing he mentions early on in the rally is that his mom is now 10 years sober. And I was far enough along in this book at that point to process the emotional weight of that. That was a really good thing to hear. One of my takeaways from hearing him speak in person was that he's proud of America, and that's not just an abstract concept of America for him. I remember when I was younger especially, I had to figure out what America means, like what it means to be American and to have national pride. That wasn't just an inherent thing. But for JD though, the depth of that pride that I could see really struck me. And that was one of my main takeaways from that. I mentioned earlier on that his getting to Yale made him wonder why people like him tend not to make it that far in life. That question stuck with him, quote, "Months away from graduating Yale Law School, I should have felt on top of the world. Instead, I found myself wondering the same thing I'd wondered for much of the past year, whether people like us can ever truly change," end quote. So at this point, rather than trying to identify the problem, it's more looking inward at himself and making some of the changes he knows he needs to make. Quote, "Upward mobility is never clean cut, and the world I left always finds a way to reel me back in," end quote. Obligations to help his mom at various times when she's in and out of rehab. Quote, "The best way to look at the problems of hillbilly culture might be to recognize that you probably can't fix these things. They'll always be around, but maybe you can put your thumb on the scale a little for the people at the margins," end quote. Quote, "There were many thumbs put on my scale," end quote. These personal, spiritual, cultural, psychological problems, these are the type of things that you can lead a horse to water, so to speak. And yeah, the best that you can do sometimes is just putting your thumb on that scale. And one of the things I do with my channel is at least leading that horse to water, trying to explain in logical terms the ways that self-improvement is better than self-indulgence. That's something I'm mindful of when I make these videos. Now over to some of my thoughts on it, just various collected thoughts in no particular order. I already went over his purpose for writing, but I want to hit on that again just because we're at the end of the summary of the video. Presenting the American dream as his family encountered it, and also asking why is it so hard for people in hillbilly culture, not just to make it ahead in life, but to just survive at times. And I think the learned willfulness, as he describes it, is definitely a central aspect of this book. When I was collecting my thoughts on this, I found myself substituting that term, learned willfulness, for work ethic. And I found myself puzzling at that. Why would my mind frame it in that way? And it might just be one of those things. I'm Pennsylvania Dutch, I can't help it, but at the same time it is different from the specific type of meaning that the author is trying to convey. But also it's hard to differentiate. It reminds me of a time when I was still only just picking this book up. I was still in the introduction, and I heard a group of left-wing friends of mine say that in essence, the core message of this book is JD trying to make people into better workers. And of course, let's address the obvious, it was missing the point because it was trying to frame the book as a pro-corporate piece of writing, which they were trying to fit it into their worldview of communism in that way. So yes, obviously it was missing the point in that way, but on a deeper level, is it wrong to say that the book is trying to make us better workers not just for a boss, not just for a corporation, but for ourselves? Quote, "You can walk through a town where 30% of the young men work fewer than 20 hours a week and find not a single person aware of his own laziness," end quote. So when you get quotes like that from this book, it's hard not to think of it in terms of just lazy versus hardworking. But I think a more accurate way to think of it still is that learned helplessness versus learned willfulness. In similar concepts, I've thought of it before, like finding a light switch in a dark room when you don't know that there's any light switch there. You don't know that you should be looking for one, you just have to stumble across it, find it, and then realize, wow, I can turn on the light. In certain
some ways, years ago for me, when I woke up to some of this stuff, that's how I would describe how it felt to realize I was capable of doing some of these things. So in that way, if you talk to someone who hasn't found the light switch yet, it's not about just being lazy. You're not going to get the message through in that way. I'll be a broken clock and relate it back to Fight Club again. The part where the homework assignment is to go out and start a fight and then lose that fight. The point of that is showing people what they're capable of. People who hadn't ever thought before about fighting for fun, well, now all of a sudden they're thinking about it. Hey, I'm capable of doing this. I have power. I'm able to physically overpower someone if I put my mind to it. Now let's apply that to career. Let's imagine going back and talking to the middle school version of J.D. Vance. Do you think you will ever be a lawyer? No? Well, you're going to go to Yale Law School. Do you think you're ever going to be a politician? No? You are going to be Senator of Ohio. In fact, more than that, you are going to be Vice President of the United States. How's that sound? Imagine having that conversation with someone who hasn't yet realized the potential of what they can do in this life. That's what the book is about. And it's about more than work ethic, because you can be the absolute best burger flipper there is, but success takes more than that. It takes a certain kind of vision, and it takes the determination to see it through. Hey, maybe that makes sense, maybe it doesn't, I don't know. But one of my takeaways from this book is I did gain a lot more respect for Marines specifically, because of what JD wrote about his experience in the military. That sense of learned willfulness that got instilled. When someone takes that to the extreme like they do in the Marines, if they have a goal that they're serious about, they will give it their all, and because of that full and complete effort of human willpower, it is going to be so challenging to stop them. And something else, another group I gain respect for is the mental sharpness of Yale grads, because I know 3 of them. The first, obviously, is J.D. Vance. I've read his book, I've seen his academic prowess, I've seen him on the debate stage, on the campaign trail. I'm impressed by the academic training he has. Now, the other is his wife, Usha, who, in fact, was JD's debate prep for that VP debate in 2024. Now, you may say, what qualifications does she have? Well, Yale Law is a pretty good qualification for that. Think about what it takes to be a lawyer, not just knowing a lot of law. Okay, if someone knows the first thing about how a law is laid out, you'd be able to Google and find the specific law that you need, and if you're trained in how to read that type of legal language, then you'll be able to figure out the document. But it takes more than that to be a lawyer. It takes the sharpness of mind to interpret it, to turn an argument over in your head. It takes the sharpness of mind to read a legal document and argue one way or the other, both ways, in any given legal case. And even more than that, it takes the rhetorical skill to speak and be persuasive in a courtroom. It also takes the strategic mindset to know when not to speak, what to say, what to stay quiet about. Both Usha and JD have that legal training, and what's more, JD has experience doing public relations in the military. These are 2 extremely intelligent individuals married to each other. If JD runs for president in 28, I would not bet against him. But back to what I was saying about Yale, the 3rd Yale graduate that I know is Michael Knowles. I enjoy very much listening to his show because it's interesting. He has extremely thoughtful takes on some of these things. I actually end up disagreeing with him quite frequently, but it's funny how often we reach the same conclusion but take different paths to get there. And even when I do disagree with Knowles, it's always interesting to really listen, to really turn over in your head the issue he's talking about and his reasoning for it. So that is what I've seen of Yale graduates, and I am impressed. As far as what this book felt like to read on a more superficial level, it reminds me a bit of Gulag Archipelago, not in the depressing ways, but because Solzhenitsyn lays out a lot of the first-hand experiences, lays that in front of the reader, and then with that basis, that's when he starts getting into the real main point of the ideas he wants to convey. And it feels like a similar way that JD went about this, lays out all the story of his childhood and his family, and then the parts during and after his time in Yale Law School, that's when he starts laying out a lot of his ideas. Now, as far as what I think about JD as a politician, or specifically as Trump's choice for his running mate, I am glad that we have an incoming vice president who understands that learned willfulness in such a significant way. Someone who's able to match Trump at that, as a matter of fact. I am glad we have someone who's able to put themselves through as rigorous a schedule as JD described during his community college days,
crisis. Of course, we all know the trope: if the phone rings at 3 a.m. that there's a nuclear war starting. Trump and JD need to be up, prepared, mentally sharp. Trump has been able to do that for most of his life. I know he's getting up there in years. JD, I know for a fact, can do that. But the third reason I'm glad JD was picked, it's something he also matches Trump on. It's his care for middle America. I've read through The Art of the Deal by Trump, and there are certain anecdotes in there that you can just tell he cares about regular people, even though he's in the millionaire class. And then JD, read through his life story, he is one of those regular people. He just self-taught himself how to rise above his circumstances. But he still has a lot of compassion for people from his hometown, for people from flyover states, for people from Middletown, Ohio. That is something that I can really appreciate in a vice president. And in fact, if I had to venture a guess, I would say all three of those things are probably criteria Trump had in mind when he was going through and picking a running mate.